I'm going to give a deeply oversimplified angle on the context of what's happening in 2024.
Sure.
So Sheikh Hasina has been in power for 15 years. All we heard about Sheikh Hasina's regime till up to about 2 years ago was positive things. That it's helped the country's per capita GDP, etc., etc. She's great for the women's workforce in Bangladesh. These were the kind of narratives that would reach us in India. Uh, Over the last 2 years, you hear about a little bit of chaos here and there, some commotion, and then suddenly this situation breaks out. Now, what the internet tells us about this situation is that there was a reservation based quota system when it came to jobs in civil service. So the bureaucrats, the government jobs, they were mostly reserved for the descendants of freedom fighters from the 1971 movement. The rest of the country had a problem with this. The political angle here is Sheikh Hasina's Awami League found its vote bank within the families of the freedom fighters. So if they withdrew these reservations for government jobs, she'd also lose her vote bank's favor. This was kind of the core context of the beginnings of this revolution. Tension kept building up, statements were made, and then literally in like a week's time, that whole country has erupted. But over the last 2 years, I believe there has been a bit of an economic downfall of Bangladesh triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war. Because I believe Bangladesh had very limited exports, and those few exports, which I'm sure jute is one of them, I don't remember the other one.
It's actually become a significant manufacturing hub as well, right? So there's a big difference between exporting jute and exporting finished product. And in fact, a lot of the clothes that all of us would have worn from any of the kind of fast fashion chains all over the world, you'll often be seeing made in Bangladesh. So, right alongside Vietnam, Bangladesh has actually been a significant, has seen a significant rise in local manufacturing for low-end goods. So that was a part of the economy. But, to your point about the economic situation in Bangladesh, look, again, in general, and you'll find there are very few nations on this planet that are truly capable of weathering crises. You need to have a range of internal intrinsic natural resources. You need a well-organized internal system, both in terms of your private and public sector. You need a relatively educated and capable population. And so, there are certain economies, and I'd point to the Russian economy as one that, you wouldn't hear about as the most exciting place to go and move to and, take a tech job and all of that. But like, that nation can sustain a 20-year conflict. And that's a different form of resilience than, say some Western models of purely capitalist societies. And so, but coming back to Bangladesh, I think that Sheikh Hasina's rule, it turns out, was always more fraught than we in India thought.
So the narrative we got here was one-sided.
This goes maybe to the point that a lot of the material that we consume nowadays is telling more of a story than delivering facts, right? And I'm sure you've covered this with other guests, but it's becoming increasingly a challenge that each of us needs to take up ourselves to make sure that we're not ending up self-propagandizing ourselves by making certain choices online in terms of the kind of content we consume, thereby encouraging the algorithm to give us only one type of content, and subconsciously ending up stopping to question our sources. And so, the narrative in India on Bangladesh, I'll be very honest with you, my general opinion has been India's never cared enough. If you really had to critique the Indian perspective on Bangladesh, what I'd say is that it is appalling that we've managed to go and give birth to a country in 1970-71 and failed to truly exercise hegemony over it, right? And it's the same failing that we see in Nepal, where there's been a sort of, Maoist-led Chinese influence takeover. It's the same failing in Pakistan, where we've historically had no influence at all. It's the same failing in Sri Lanka, where we've, again allowed other powers to come and become as powerful and influential in our neighborhood as we have. And now we have, with the departure of Sheikh Hasina, effectively another relatively if not unfriendly, at least not a power with whom we have deep influence. And so the big challenge from the Indian perspective is that how is it that we're unable to wield influence even in our immediate neighborhood?
Okay. This is kind of an Akhand Bharat conversation. It's going in that realm.
Yeah, well, I mean that's a very, again, we need to cover public international law and the notion of sovereignty, and the fact that sort of traditional expansionist powers are really no longer the way nations operate, the way we compete, the way we wield influence, the way we play the great game is very different from back in the day, right? It's no longer necessarily about let's launch an invasion across the border and go and take more land. It's more about how do we go and as I say, wield influence through the political class. How do we go and own the most important assets? How do we dominate the most important areas of economic activity, right? I mean, so given the amount the world has changed, one doesn't necessarily any longer as a policymaker, as a strategist, think purely in terms of let's send tanks across the border. Although, given what's happening in Ukraine, there is still a part of what's going on, but it's a very, very particular set of circumstances that leads to that.
Okay. The explanation I gave about the recent events, would you like to add anything to that? The student protests.
Yeah, so in fact, I did want to address the point about reservations, it really paints that story of the two social streams in Bangladesh, right? A number of people that felt excluded from Bangladeshi society, like an entire section of their population effectively, that felt excluded because they didn't feel a part of the independence movement, right? So this reservation issue, I think, ended up becoming emblematic of the fact that Bangladeshi society seemed to be dominated by just one generation, and the part of society in 70-71 that decided to fight, and as we know, with all these issues, with the lack of records and all that, who's taking advantage of some freedom fighter card and who's not, and which is a real story and which is not really a real story, etc., becomes very, very complicated very quickly. But for me, the important thing is this: if you look at the reservation issue in Bangladesh, it wasn't just Sheikh Hasina's government has been in power for 15 years. She wants to, line the pockets of her voters. Therefore, this policy exists. For 15 years, people have been screaming against it. Nothing's happened. And finally, out of sheer frustration, they came out onto the streets. That is not the story. The reality is that the government's gone back and forth. There's been a political process. There's even been a legal process. And various courts in Bangladesh have found both for and against this reservation policy from the perspective of the Bangladeshi constitution. Now, we might criticize all of that, but the reality is that is democratic process in action. That's democracy as it's meant to be. That's meant to be discussion. We agree, we disagree. This policy can be improved. I'm going to go challenge it in court. I'm going to challenge it at the hustings and try to change government through an electoral process. And instead of any of that, at the end of the day, Sheikh Hasina ended up being ousted purely through street violence. And that for sure is not a democratic process. And so, I think that this issue of the reservations ended up becoming the straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were. I think there were far deeper cultural questions that I think a lot of countries are answering all over the world. I mean, I think a major one in Bangladesh is, are they an Islamic nation or are they a secular one? And so in many ways, Sheikh Hasina represented the Mujib, almost Mujibism, and it is called Mujibism, this secular, socialist, big tent party that, think of it as the Congress of India, right? And her ouster might be representative of a takeover of a more muscularly Islamist ideology. And to the sort of, careful observers of Bangladesh, even over the last 20 years, you could see the signs. You had the occasional arm being chopped off. You had the occasional blasphemy controversy. You had the occasional minority oppression incident where you could see that, look, not dissimilarly to Pakistan, mobs can gather and cause street violence very easily in Bangladesh. And what you finally saw was that same potential ending up realizing itself at such a scale that Sheikh Hasina had to flee.
If you enjoyed today's clip, make sure you check out these curated playlists that we've made especially for you related to the subject that was spoken about in this clip.